Let's talk about the Team ICO games. Whenever the topic of video games as an art form comes up, usually the video games designed by Fumito Ueda come up. In fact, Shadow of the Colossus specifically has been used as the poster boy for the topic of video games as an art form.
Completely without hyperbole, one of the most unique video games ever made. There is, quite simply, no other game out there quite like this one. It's also one of the most beautiful tragedies ever told in a video game story.
The great film critic Roger Ebert once said that video games can never be an art form. This was mainly because video games were mechanically simplistic at the time. I should note that Roger Ebert was very fond of Hayao Miyazaki's movies, and when he asked him how his movies work so well, Miyazaki described this technique used in his storytelling, ma. Ma is a Japanese term for silence, quiet, serenity. He described it as the space between claps. If you have too much clapping all the time, then there's no space to breathe. But if you allow spaces between the clapping, you allow your audience to have the time to soak in certain moments, certain thoughts, certain feelings, and the atmosphere, and the implications of the thematics. I wonder how Roger Ebert would have responded to the technique of ma in Fumito Ueda's games. All these games, to varying degrees, have been described as masterpieces and have been described as the standard for narrative innovation in the video game industry.
The thing you need to understand about Team ICO, the original developers of the game, is that they are, at the end of the day, experienced game creators. They make games like they want to. No trend following and little mechanical grace and swiftness to support the gameplay. They created, and still create to this day under new management, raw and emotional minimalistic experiences that sacrifice tightness and satisfaction for the odd clunky questionable thing for the sake of making the player connect with the characters and the world of the game on another level.
While the greatness of these games is not limited to one motivating factor, one of the primary factors is Ueda's minimalist design philosophy, which he calls design by subtraction. By removing things like a heads-up display, or complex combat, or multiple characters, the gamer is left to derive value from the elements that are left over. This is what enabled things like the relationship between ICO and Ueda to be so powerful, or the feelings of isolation and shadow to produce deep contemplation and melancholy. It's because the gamer invests more of themselves in the few elements that are present and subsequently gets more out of them.
In their games, you're never overpowered and there's rarely a straightforward plot aside from arguably The Last Guardian, and there's never a dull idea or concept. Even better, these concepts are nearly always executed in a giant and elegant, but to emphasize, minimalistic way. They also follow the same kind of themes, such as making towering monsters of worlds that are almost characters themselves, that engulf your characters to make you feel as tiny and insignificant as possible. Player control having a direct connection with the characters' feelings and how they interact with the game world, and using mind-blowing and heavily orchestrated original scores to complement these themes.
Though many other games have followed Ueda's model with great degrees of success, it has never been perfectly replicated.
One of my main goals on this channel is to raise awareness of great works of art in a variety of mediums. Of course, you'll know me as raising awareness of art within animation. However, I also take interest in raising awareness of art in the video game format, because why do I keep picking? I might as well just keep holding it. You see, the unique aspect about video games as an artistic medium is their capacity for interactive engagement. These games take advantage of this unique academic concept known as ludonarrative harmony. Ludonarrative harmony is essentially the concept that describes how well a game and its story meshes well together. Of course, you could be completely comfortable with just playing something like, say, The Last of Us or Final Fantasy VII, where the game's story is almost somewhat different, but they don't necessarily contradict. But what's unique about Fumito Ueda's games and other games like this is that the story itself is not just restricted to cutscenes. The story is interweaved into the gameplay itself, and through that, Fumito Ueda, this video game auteur, has revolutionized the way we perceive narrative in video games today. Fumito Ueda is a Japanese video game designer who started off as an animator and took inspiration from a very early cinematic adventure platformer game and used that inspiration to create ICO, a game which would very much encourage narratives in video game form.
Kudos to the investors behind these games because they helped produce two of the most influential games of all time. Seriously, all the people behind the greatest games ever seem to cite ICO and Shadow of the Colossus as an inspiration.
ICO was originally made for the PlayStation 1, and it was fairly innovative for this kind of game to even work on that kind of system for its time. Yet, due to the fact that the PlayStation 1 was on its last days of financial popularity, and the PlayStation 2 was beginning to become marketable, especially with the PlayStation 2 to this day holding a record of being one of the best-selling consoles of all time, Fumito Ueda transitioned development of ICO to the PlayStation 2, and the gameplay mechanics and the lighting was very much improved for the early days of the PlayStation 2. So, what is the premise of ICO? Allow me to read you this instruction manual. Oh yeah. Aiko's nightmare began on the day he drew his first breath. At the moment when he was raised up to the light, a scream rang out into the night. For there in plain view was the sign. 2 horns. Quite small but quite distinct, protruding from either side of the newborn infant's head. There was no joyous celebration of Aiko's birth. Also, why do people pronounce this game as ICO? That never made sense to me. It's clearly an I. That should be ICO. When people say eco, I assume eco-friendly. And economics, you know? Why do people pronounce this as eco? Why not ICO? Anyway, there was no joyous celebration of Aiko's birth. No proud expression in his father's eyes. His arrival brought only suspicion and fear. The villagers had hoped against hope that the curse might skip their generation. But here was the sign, and it could not be ignored. Nor could the plagues that struck their children, or the failure of the harvest year after year. They prayed desperately for the day when the tribulations would end. That day, as tradition decreed, was the day of Aiko's 12th birthday. At dawn, the faceless horsemen came for Aiko. His family did not try to resist, nor did they weep for the loss of their child. Aiko's fate had been decided long ago. The horsemen rode deep into the dark, twisting forest. Although Aiko did not know what his final destination was to be, he could feel his fear rising with every moment that had passed. After many hours, an ancient fortress ruin came into view. It stood vast and foreboding against the stormy horizon. Aiko could hear the sound of waves crashing against the rocky cliffs below. His heart began to pound in his chest as he searched desperately for a way to escape, but found none. His time had come. Ignoring his desperate cries, the horsemen dragged the terrified boy through the fortress gates and into a vast stone hall. Its walls were filled from floor to ceiling with rows of strange stone caskets. It was at that moment that Aiko realized what his fate was to be. The horsemen bundled him into a casket and pulled the heavy stone lid closed, shutting out the light forever. Aiko was left alone in the darkness, sentenced to spend the rest of eternity in silent torment. But now fate had granted a reprieve. Aiko would discover that he is not alone in this mysterious place. A young girl named Ueda has been held captive in the fortress, consumed by loneliness and sorrow. With Aiko's encouragement, she will begin to have hope once more. However, they will quickly discover that the entire castle is a prison, a fortress from which escape will not be easy. Shadowy spirits emerge from gloomy corners, desperate to drag Ueda back into the darkness. Every twisting staircase, creaking door, and towering pillar is part of a larger puzzle. Each torch and shaft of light only serve to illuminate another mystery. But together, if the pair persevere, they will surely find a way out, a way back to the light. You like my reading? Something worth noting is that when we see the introductory cutscene of the earthquake making Aiko's stone casket fall and cracking open so that Aiko can be set free, he has some kind of supernatural vision of Yorda consumed in darkness in a cage. And then when the player takes control of Aiko, the player and in turn Aiko eventually come across the very towering location where Yorda is held captive just as he saw in the vision. Now, during this moment of gameplay, first getting used to the controls where enemies aren't really attacking you yet because the enemies don't perceive you as compromising their leader's mission regarding Yorda, you'll notice that there's a lack of a heads-up display. For those of you who don't know, a heads-up display refers to the in-game appearance of, say, a health bar, a map indicator, an arrow telling you where to go, side quest, main quest objective notifications, so on and so forth. You won't find any of that in this game. The only thing you get that could arguably be heads up, debatably, are the subtitles in the cutscenes. But yeah, we're talking gameplay here. There's no heads up display to be found, and the game doesn't really give you a hint on how to control Aiko as you escape the castle. The game leaves you to your own intuition to figure out how the game works. Although, to be fair, you could just read the instruction manual and just figure out how to play from there. But still, this lack of overt advice and the lack of a heads-up display means that players can focus on being in the present moment and getting immersed in this atmospheric castle. I can tell you, there's many people who remember in their childhood days of the PlayStation 2 recalls in some way or another coming across the demo for Ico, and they can remember this eerie yet beautiful atmosphere of the castle and the minimalist approach of this isolating feeling, and you controlling Aiko and forming an intimate bond with Yorda. The sense of isolation in this castle enhances the bond you form with Yorda, which plays a crucial role in the game. When you set Yorda free, three things become apparent to you. Number one, Aiko and Yorda speak completely different languages, as indicated by the subtitles. So the two of them have to rely on universal body language in order to understand each other and to communicate in any meaningful way. Secondly, the moment Yorda gets released, just a few seconds or so after their first encounter, they both find that there's these dark, shadowy demon creatures that want to drag Yorda back into captivity. So Aiko has to fend them off. Thirdly, Yorda has some supernatural light ability that enables her to open these gates that Aiko couldn't on his own, and this in turn supernaturally zaps away the demonic creatures nearby. Take note on the fact that Yorda can zap nearby enemies by opening these doors, because there was one particular segment in the game when I was trying to get Yorda from one place to another, and due to the gameplay loop of the combat, which I'll get into later, I just took a long time to fend off enemies. It just seemed like it would never end, but the moment I actually got Yorda to the door, it zapped away all the enemies. So one of my frustrations with this game is the fact that there's some elements that the game doesn't make obvious to you, and I know that's kind of the point for the sake of immersion, but still, you can tell that this was Fumito Ueda's early days on figuring out the game design, which can lead to a lot of frustration, such as the very repetitive combat system, which can be very frustrating if you're not familiar with how it works. Because when you go into it, the first hour or so will give you the indication that there's this gameplay loop where you just keep whacking the enemies until they eventually go away, which made that particular moment all the more frustrating when the game doesn't overtly tell you, actually, you can just skip all that entirely. To be fair, again, this is something you can find out by just having Ueda interact with a gate which zaps all the nearby enemies. But, you know, it could have been more obvious. With this minimalist game design, Fumito Ueda could have found a way to make that more clear, whether perhaps have some kind of cutscene where the supernatural light can zap away an enemy overtly. Something like that could have worked without compromising the minimalist game design. Something I really appreciate about ICO's design is the mechanic of how ICO guides Ueda around the castle. Ueda is your only friend and companion throughout this whole isolating experience, which makes your bond that much stronger. And you form a bond with Ueda through a very unique mechanic. In order to guide Ueda around, you as ICO have to literally hold down the R1 button to hold Ueda's hand. And if you let go, ICO lets go too. So you have to literally hold down the button to hold Ueda's hand in the game. And this can lead to a very intimate connection of interactivity. And this simple choice of how ICO interacts with Ueda is such a genius design because it leads to a sense of companionship throughout the experience. It's such a genius way to integrate the story of companionship in this isolating setting with the actual mechanics of the gameplay itself. And this is an example of what I mean by ludonarrative harmony.
The important thing to remember though, despite how big these games look, is the minimalism of them and how everything they do is not necessarily done for the sake of fun or mechanical tightness to satisfy the player. You could be holding the hand of a girl and feeling her weight drag behind you as you hold a trigger button, but then whenever you let go of the trigger button, you will let go of her. Or you could be repeatedly shouting at a large bird dog thing until it learns to obey you and adapt to your puzzle solving. It's that kind of thing.
And it strengthens the game experience. Even when you look at this exclusive cover art for the UK and for Japan, you'll notice that there's an emphasis on just being immersed into the experience itself, as well as exploring the castle to figure things out. It's one of those kinds of games where the puzzles are fairly interesting, the fact that it's so simple, but you still have to take the effort into figuring out how to get through certain areas, which makes it more rewarding when you actually do manage to figure it out. Another unique mechanic in the game is the way that you can save the game, in that there's these benches, and the only way to save the game is if both ICO and Ueda are sitting down together, which can make for a very nice moment of relaxation. And this also makes for a really profound moment later on in the game whenever the two of them are separated and ICO has to take the effort into long segments of gameplay. And like I said before, my only major complaint with the game is how repetitive the combat sequence is. There's not really much variety in the combat, and the enemies take a long time to hit down, and it can be pretty frustrating. But I have no complaints about the awkwardnesses of playing as any of the central characters in any of these games, because the beauty of the awkwardnesses of controlling the main characters of all these games that Fumito Ueda has designed so far is that they actually enhance the experience by making you immersed in the characters. With each of these main characters, you're not really playing as seasoned warriors like, say, Master Chief or Kratos or Cloud Strife, so on and so forth. You're playing as the underdogs. You're playing as young boys who are barely getting the grasps of fighting off their opponents, getting by the environment. Now, debatably, the exception to that could be Wander from Shadow of the Colossus, but even then, it's implied that Wander is an experienced hunter, but not really an experienced warrior. And you can tell that by the way he's very proficient with the bow and arrow, but seems to fumble quite a lot in the way he handles the sword. But we'll get to that when we get to that. For now, ICO is a very unique, minimalist, beautiful experience, which is definitely a period for its time, but at the same time profoundly impacted the way narrative works in the video game format. So I give ICO a 10 out of 12. It is a fantastic, simple game with a very immersive story about companionship in the midst of overwhelmingly bleak, isolated settings, and it can be fairly lighthearted in that way. It is fairly frustrating with some of the mechanics, but it's not something to complain about too much in the long term. And besides, Fumito Ueda was just getting started. So now we raise the stakes with Shadow of the Colossus, a game that has been deemed so great, it has been paired with some of the greatest video games of all time, up there with the likes of Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, Portal 2, so on and so forth. This is hailed as one of the greatest games ever made.
The game stands the test of time in almost every way possible. You have these epic battles against enormous beasts, each battle being a puzzle of how to get on the beast and reach its weak points. And then you have these tranquil, contemplative moments where you're just riding your horse across the barren wasteland, which sounds boring, but it really isn't. If it was, it wouldn't be on like every top 50 list of games ever.
Take a shot. If you're familiar with my videos, you're probably familiar with this same title screen and this same soundtrack. Depending on who you ask, that can speak volumes about its quality, or it being a concept that's interesting and shareable if somewhat unpolished as a game. Personally, I'm on the side of the fence that's more optimistic about it. The bosses themselves are puzzles. Most other games like this would either just have you dodge attacks until it shows a weak point for you to strike. Revealing these bosses' weak points requires you to think a little outside the box. Sometimes you gotta take advantage of its curiosity. Sometimes you have to emotionally manipulate it. Sometimes you just have to physically manipulate it. The game is paced very well too, having you travel across a beautiful landscape for a time as a build-up before each boss. The story itself is pretty interesting, if a bit vague, but the images it presents you with allow you to fill in the gaps however you like, without feeling like it wants you to think like an artiste about it.
Every single aspect of the game mechanics here takes advantage of what Ueda learned from in ICO and applies it to a very unique open world experience that is meant to convey an epic tragedy akin to, say, Oedipus or Shakespearean tragedies. And because of how striking the narrative in Shadow of the Colossus is,
critics praised it pretty highly, and players loved it, but despite its many qualities, it's a very slow game with very awkward controls, so it didn't catch on much with the masses.
The premise of Shadow of the Colossus is that you play as a young man named Wander as he travels with his loyal horse Agro, carrying the corpse of a woman that is very dear to him named Mono. They travel to this ancient land where there's this shrine. After placing Mono on the altar, these shadowy creatures start to appear. Wander shows off the ancient sword that he's been carrying, an ancient sword of light, and the shadowy creatures flee, thus getting the attention of a deity-like figure named Dormin. Wander reveals to Dormin that he traveled to these ancient lands because he heard about this power that can bring people back from the dead. Dormin explains that in order to do that, you have to kill all 16 colossi in order to destroy their respective idols in this shrine hall. Once that's achieved, Mono can come back to life. But this ritual will come at a heavy price. To which Wander responds, it doesn't matter. He is so determined to bring this beloved woman back to life that he doesn't care about the consequences that could happen. And so from there, we get this very striking open world experience.
Shadow of the Colossus has a pretty minimal story, but it also has a lot of depth, so there are a lot of details here that are kind of left open to the player's interpretation. So Wander sets off, and now we reach one of the two major elements of Shadow of the Colossus's running time, riding his horse, Agro, across a huge empty land to find the Colossi. As I mentioned before, there's no danger in the world of this game aside from the Colossi themselves, so the time between epic Colossus battles is taken up by a peaceful journey across the land.
As you play the game, you'll notice that there is a bit more of a heads-up display compared to ICO, just so you can get used to the controls this time. And certain things will immediately stand out to you. Namely, just how isolating this environment is. It's an open world game, and yet there's no overt side quest like you'd see in a lot of Ubisoft games. There's no side enemies to get in your way, and there's very little to do apart from, say, collecting fruit to increase your health bar, collecting protein from white-tailed lizards to increase your grip meter, as well as fighting the Colossi themselves and the save points you can find, and that's pretty much it. This is one of those games where, in concept, it sounds like the most boring thing ever. A game where about 70% or so of the time you're just wandering around the lands with your horse. And yet the way the mechanics work and the way the game is paced makes for such an unforgettable experience. These long interludes as you locate these colossi makes for very reflective experiences in regards to the weight that this game provides. And by the time you get used to the climbing mechanics, you'll notice something else that's very interesting. The grip button makes a comeback. Only this time it's played a crucial role in climbing up the platforms. Similar to the hand-holding mechanic in ICO, in Shadow of the Colossus, there's this very unique grip mechanic. You see, in a lot of other platformer-type games, like, say, Mario or the Lego games, or even other adventure-type games like, say, the Batman Arkham series or The Legend of Zelda, whenever a character climbs onto a surface or gets onto a ledge, they do so automatically, just tap a button to get them to get up. But in Shadow of the Colossus, you have to manually hold down the R1 button so that Wander can grip onto vines, cliff edges, and so on and so forth. You'll notice that these games have a very organic feel, and any awkwardnesses in regards to the physics and the way characters interact with the environments enhances the experience of being these underdog-type characters. Something else you'll notice is the way that Wander controls aggro. In a lot of other games like Ocarina of Time or Red Dead Redemption, when you control the horse, you just control the horse straightforward as that. But in Shadow of the Colossus, I've heard it said that it's less like you're in direct control of the horse, and more so like you're controlling Wander controlling the horse. Aggro was designed to kind of have a mind of her own. So you have to keep tapping the X button to encourage Aggro to keep going. And Aggro will have slightly delayed responses to the way you want to go left or right, and so on and so forth. And if you combine the grip button and movement mechanics with aggro in a certain way, you can pull off these really cool stunts. Which you don't have to do, but it's cool that it's in there anyway. Aggro is your one and only companion in this game. And once again, this increases the sense of relationship you feel with this particular character. And then of course you have the fight with the Colossi themselves, which many players say is one of the best sets of boss fights you'll ever encounter in any game, up there with the likes of Asura's Wrath and Metal Gear Rising and so on and so forth. These opponents, with two exceptions, are enormous, and ideally what you have to do is figure out their weak points in order to climb them and then stab them in their certain weak spots, mainly the head. And only the Ancient Sword can reveal what their weak points actually are. And the grip mechanic really enhances the intensity of the fights.
Remember when I said the awkwardness of the game is more of a strength than a weakness in the end? This is the main reason why. Shadow of the Colossus builds dramatic tension primarily through the simple fact that you are small and incapable and taking on things much, much larger than yourself. I mean, look at him run with that sword, flailing it about like a kid playing with a stick. The controls themselves are kind of awkward. Some of this is just due to the era the game was made in, before we figured stuff out like aiming with the camera instead of the player, or, actually controlling the camera in any manageable way in the first place. The movement always feels just a bit off. The biggest gameplay element that adds tension and emphasizes Wander's desperate lack of competence in this situation is a simple mechanic that's, far as I know, completely unique to this game: the grip button and stamina meter.
Because you only have so long before your character lets go and needs to recover the grip. And the Colossi are going to try to shake you off like some kind of annoying fly. And yet something very off-putting happens whenever you and in turn Wander kill off a Colossi. When a Colossi dies, you're not really greeted with a victory theme akin to the one heard in Final Fantasy VII, say, what you're greeted with is a very solemn funeral-like piece of music. Which seems to indicate that Wander just killed off something sacred. And to add to the sense of unease, these dark tendrils emerge from a slain Colossi to penetrate Wander rather viciously, rendering Wander unconscious, and then gets transported back to the temple.
People tend to remember the music that plays at the end of these Colossus battles quite vividly. It sounds majestic, which is, of course, very fitting, but also sad. It makes you feel less like you just vanquished a mighty beast, and more like you just destroyed a magnificent creature, something innocent, maybe even sacred. And those tendrils of darkness plunging into you at the end of the battle don't really ease your mind. After defeating the first Colossus, you wake up back in the temple with a shadowy figure standing over you. And after defeating the second, there are 2, then 3. And it continues this way all the way until you're consistently waking up in a circle of shadow people. A reveal later on gives us a bit of detail to help figure out what these things are, but regardless, it's kind of unsettling. Another thing the game handles, in kind of a unique and interesting way, is your horse. This is your one horse, your companion. He follows you, he always comes when you call, and you fight many a battle together with him. Shadow of the Colossus is an inherently lonely experience. You're alone in a vast game world, and the only other people around are an evil entity and a dead girl. Aggro is your only company throughout the entire game, and that makes it natural to connect with him. An interesting touch they put on him was that you don't control him directly. In most games, riding a horse means you control the horse. In Shadow of the Colossus, you control Wander controlling the horse. He has a mind of his own sometimes, and his response to your commands feels more like you're pulling reins than directly controlling his movement. This makes him a bit frustrating to ride at first, but by the time you finish the game, you've gotten used to it and you can ride him like a pro, which I think strengthens the bond you feel with him. Beyond that, they put in a lot of small touches that help you grow close to him, like letting you pet him while you're sitting on him, or even the way if you shoot him with an arrow, he'll freak out whenever you draw your bow for a while afterward. They really made him feel alive, and it's easy to develop a connection with him.
Even though the first Colossi did attack you on sight, which can catch a lot of players off guard in the long term, if you get what I mean, most of the Colossi you encountered, not all of them, but most of the Colossi are docile and don't attack you until you attack them. Wander is essentially killing off 16 sacred creatures just to bring one person back to life? And said sacred creatures don't appear to be a major threat to anything or anyone, so in hindsight, why are you killing them?
As you continue, you start noticing some variance in the Colossi. One defining characteristic across the notable majority is that they don't attack you. Or at least if they do, it's only in self-defense. Most of them don't care you're there, and some of them never even do anything to directly harm you, even as you're killing them. By and large, they don't seem to be a danger to anything or anyone. So why are you killing them? This unease comes to a head when you encounter a small Colossus, yeah, not all of them are absurdly huge, that guards some kind of sacred flame. And the way to beat it is to discover its weakness. It fears the fire it guards. When you wield flame against it, it cowers like a scared puppy and swats pathetically at you, just trying to get you to go away without angering you. You exploit its fear to lead it off a cliff, then jump on its back and stab it to death. We've seen a variety of Colossi at this point, but this is the first time we've seen one show discernible human emotion, crippling fear, and we take advantage of that fear to kill it. It's actually kind of horrible.
This is a brilliantly subversive take on Legend of Zelda, because in other games like this, you're this hero who will stand up against these evil monsters and other kinds of demonic forces. But in this game, the game geniusly has this plot twist where Wander starts to look like a villain.
Drop him.
I know it's our job to help this guy and everything, but I think this guy's a lost cause. He's obviously made up his mind.
And you begin to question, is it really worth killing all these creatures just to bring this one person back to life? And from there, the game interweaves these implied themes about grief, about this individual who refuses to accept his fate, and all this leads up to a devastating yet simultaneously beautiful finale, which does have this implication of redemption by the end, but I won't give it away in case you haven't played it. But needless to say, it's unforgettable. And you can play a remake of this game on the PlayStation 4, which has updated graphics, as well as a brand new control scheme for anyone willing to try it, as well as some new features in said game. So now, we also have The Last Guardian, which was made for the PlayStation 4. Now, this game has a particularly interesting history. Fumito Ueda was quite pleasantly surprised at the positive feedback he got from designing Aggro. A lot of people felt this intimate bond with Aggro, the horse, and so Ueda decided to take the mechanics applied to Aggro and amplify them for Trico, the main creature of The Last Guardian.
Ready? Aim! Go! Go! Yes! Yes! Woo! I did it! Saved in the bronze.
Now, this game was originally meant for the PlayStation 3, but due to needing to actually fix the game, including actually make the creature work in a coherent manner rather than just how he appeared in a promotional cinematic, and due to corporate production reasons of transitioning the game from the PlayStation 3 to the PlayStation 4, and due to the sheer amount of effort put into implementing the AI of Trico as a companion character, the game took a total of, get this, 9 years to develop. Yes, you heard me correctly. This game took almost an entire decade to make. Fumito Ueda is the kind of game creator who really takes his time when it comes to the kind of games he makes. As of 2025, when I'm recording this, it has only recently been announced that Fumito Ueda has been working on a new project which has been publicly known as Project Robot. Yeah, 2 decades, and he's only made 3 games. So now with The Last Guardian, the premise is very much similar to ICO, but now the roles are reversed. You play as a young boy who has been taken away from his home village, and he finds himself in captivity with this large creature that he calls Trico. The boy starts acting kind to Trico by feeding Trico and setting Trico free, and the two of them form a bond, and the boy collaborates with Trico to escape this desolate area. Once again, much like the 2 prior games, you're in this ancient ruined area, only this time it's Trico who has the capacity to fend off enemies, whereas the boy that you play as is the one who helps to open up these pathways. So in order to get through this game, the game has these very unique mechanics where you as the boy have to learn how to communicate to Trico. Now, a lot of people find The Last Guardian to be particularly frustrating because Trico doesn't immediately respond to the boy, and sometimes will have a mind of his own, and sometimes would just rather scratch an ear rather than go up to a certain platform to open a certain gateway. People complain about that, but here's the thing. That's the point. Ueda geniusly designed the game so that Trico would feel like an authentic animal that you have to learn to communicate with. And so the game is encouraging patience, which is honestly very refreshing for an industry that so easily encourages these immediate dopamine experiences. Video games often orient themselves around these immediate fast-paced action set pieces, and understandably so. You've got the input, you've got the element of power fantasy. It's understandable why this is so. But when players criticize the game just because they weren't patient enough with Trico, it says something more about them rather than the game itself. With that said, I appreciate the fact that players have complained about some mechanical slip-ups such as how the boy has only primarily 2 modes of movement, where he can either move painfully slow or too dangerously fast for these very dangerous locations. There's some gameplay mechanics where Ueda trusts the gamer to take the initiative with. Like, for example, Kadika has pointed out that there's this one sequence where you don't have to keep tossing a barrel up these certain ledges in order to progress in the game. People would assume that the barrel is too heavy for the boy to carry up the ledge, but actually the physics engine will make sure that the boy is able to step up these small ledges with the barrels that he uses to feed Trico. So it's all about intuition.
Being able to step up high ledges while carrying things, which I've seen lots of people complaining about having to throw stuff everywhere, which isn't true, especially on this one puzzle which I did first try by getting a barrel up a narrow hole.
If you actually take the time to understanding the mechanics on how to communicate with Trico and how to get around the environment, it can make for a very satisfying experience in the long term, especially with how Trico behaves. Trico has to be one of the best implemented companions in all gaming history, because Trico truly does feel like an authentic character of his own, and you'll have so many fun moments with each other and so many highs and lows of emotions. It's quite the roller coaster ride.
This here is not a perfect video game mechanically, but it is perfect for a minimalist puzzle platforming adventure for this generation, if you ask me. And I don't know how PS3 could do it at all when it was originally being developed on that system. I mean, thank God that Team Ico waited. And of course, there's the bonding and reliance on Trico, the completely adorable dog, cat, bat, chicken, whale thing. You never control him, and that strengthens your bond as a player to see him act on his own accord and listen to you. The game makes you feel like you're in a proper relationship with a thing that you don't initially fall in love with or even understand. Maybe you even hate it, which you then grow to know more about and begin to trust more as he begins showing affection, slowly ignoring the things he was scared of before, and eventually saving your life on multiple occasions. And not just through visual story hints or cutscenes, but all through direct involvement with the gameplay.
When I look online and see the reaction that players have towards Trico, I'm glad that it was born. It would bring me joy to know that everyone involved in the project feels the same way. Fumito Ueda, director of The Last Guardian,
has created 3 games in total. The first was ICO, the second was the aforementioned Shadow of the Colossus, and his latest is The Last Guardian. While ICO was a groundbreaking achievement that has inspired many game developers over the years, I believe The Last Guardian is his most underappreciated work, especially in terms of using interactivity to tell its story. In The Last Guardian, you play as a young boy who wakes up in ancient ruins alongside a massive mythical creature named Trico. Chained and wounded, with spears lodged in its body, Trico is initially hostile towards you. However, as you remove its chains, tend to its wounds and offer it food, it slowly lowers its guard. To escape the ruins, the boy and Trico must work together. The boy can open gates, squeeze through tight spaces, and destroy stained glass eyes that terrify Trico, while Trico can leap across large gaps, fend off enemies, and break through walls. What makes this game such an achievement is Trico's realistic AI behavior. Trico acts like a real animal. As the boy, you can offer suggestions, but there's only about a 50-50 chance that it will listen. This can be frustrating at times, but if Trico responded immediately, it wouldn't feel like a real animal. You strengthen your bond with Trico by tending to its wounds, feeding it and calming it after battles. Over time, Trico becomes more responsive to the boy's commands and shows increasing signs of affection.
This immense bond of companionship and the themes of nature versus manufacturing stuff and all the usual themes from the 2 other games in regards to light versus darkness and how the divine light always overcomes the demonic darkness. All that is beautifully interplayed, especially with this very poignant ending, which, much like the ending of Shadow Colossus, has interactive input implied into it. So yes, that is my review of the Team Ico games. If you're curious to try out these narratively rich experiences, you can try these out in a variety of different eras of gaming, although I will say that they are exclusively PlayStation games. But fortunately, they do have a wide range of PlayStation capacity. So ICO and Shadow of the Colossus, you can get in the PlayStation 2 in their original intended visions from Ueda himself.
For the PS2.
You can get remastered versions of both ICO and Shadow of the Colossus in a double package on the PlayStation 3. And on the PlayStation 4, you can get The Last Guardian as well as the Blue Point Games remake of Shadow of the Colossus. The choice is up to you in that regard. So thank you so much for watching. What do you think of the Team ICO games, and are there any other games like these that perfectly capture the beauty of ludonarrative harmony in the way I encouraged in this video? Let me know down below, and hopefully we can keep raising awareness of the capacity for art even in video games. ScotsThinker signing out.
Well, what do we do?
Why don't we just wait here for a little while? See what happens.